In the winter of 1899, the world was preoccupied with the dawn of a new century. In New York, London, and Chicago, the air was thick with the soot of industry and the electric hum of a future that felt both inevitable and unsettling. It was an era defined by the permanence of the written word, thick, leather-bound ledgers, meticulously maintained by armies of clerks who traded their eyesight for the precision of a fountain pen. In these volumes, the financial soul of the modern citizen was etched in black ink. Your reputation, your standing in the community, and your ability to provide for your family were not abstract concepts. They were numbers on a page. But as the bells prepared to ring in the year 1900, something within the mechanism of Victorian finance began to fracture. It started not with a crash, but with a series of quiet, almost imperceptible erasures. In the back rooms of the great mercantile agencies, the precursors to our modern credit bureaus, a systemic failure was taking root. It was an error of such scale that it would eventually strip thousands of individuals of their recorded history, leaving them as ghosts in the machinery of the Gilded Age. Yet, for weeks, no one noticed. The ink was dry, the books were balanced, and the clerks went home to their families, unaware that the very foundation of the emerging middle class was being dissolved by a single catastrophic miscalculation. But that wasn't the strangest part. As the first reports of missing statements began to surface in the spring of 1899, the official response was not one of panic, but of a calculated, stony silence. To understand how a life could be erased in 1899, one must understand the weight of the mercantile report. Long before the digital score, credit was a matter of character. Agencies like R.G., Dunn & Company, and the Bradstreet Company employed thousands of local correspondents, lawyers, merchants, and postmasters to spy on their neighbors. They recorded everything: a man's drinking habits, his church attendance, the perceived stability of his marriage, and most crucially, his debts. These reports were the gatekeepers of the American dream. Without a favorable report, a merchant could not stock his shelves, and a farmer could not buy his seed. By the late 1890s, the sheer volume of these reports had become a burden. The transition from handwritten narratives to standardized, tabulated data was in full swing. It was a period of frantic modernization. The introduction of the first mechanical adding machines and the widespread adoption of carbon paper promised a new era of efficiency. But this efficiency came with a hidden cost. The systems were being built faster than they could be understood. Records suggest that in the rush to digitize, or rather, to mechanize the sprawling archives of the 19th century, a fundamental flaw was introduced into the filing logic of the central New York offices. Some historians believe that the era originated in a new indexing system designed to bridge the gap between the outgoing 19th century files and the incoming 20th century ones. There is no clear consensus on who authorized the change, but the result was a temporal dead zone. In the effort to consolidate records, thousands of files were marked with a specific clearing code that, due to a mechanical misalignment in the tabulating machines, was read as an instruction to purge. The early signs were subtle. A tailor in Philadelphia found his line of credit at the textile mill suddenly revoked, with no explanation other than record not found. A hardware wholesaler in Ohio, who had operated for 30 years, was told his history was a blank slate. These were men of standing, men whose names had been written in the ledgers for decades. And yet, when the books were opened, the pages where their lives should have been were either empty or struck through with a single crimson line. And that's when things began to shift from a clerical annoyance to a systemic collapse. By mid-1899, the Great Discrepancy, as it was whispered in the hallways of the Treasury, had moved beyond individual accounts It began to swallow entire blocks of data. The era was behaving like a slow-moving contagion, moving alphabetically through the archives of the Northeast. The discovery of the scale of the loss is often attributed to a junior auditor named Elias Thorne, whose personal correspondence from the time hints at a growing sense of dread. Thorne noted that the records weren't just being misfiled, they were being systematically overwritten by the very machines meant to preserve them. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. It wasn't just that the records were missing. It was that the machines were generating ghost statements new, entirely fabricated histories for citizens who didn't exist, while the real records were being fed into the furnaces of the back offices as reconciled waste. The development of the crisis was shielded from the public eye. In 1899, there were no consumer protection laws, no right to financial privacy, and no way for an individual to challenge the truth of the ledger. If the book said you didn't exist, for all intents and purposes, you didn't. The mercantile agencies were private kingdoms, and their archives were their law. As the era accelerated, a rift began to form between the physical reality of the marketplace and the paper reality of the banks. In the archives that remain, there is evidence of a desperate attempt to halt the erasure. Hand-drawn notations in the margins of the 1,899 summer ledgers show a frantic effort to re-index the lost names. But for every name saved, it appeared 10 more were vanishing. The mechanical tabulators, once hailed as the pinnacle of progress, had become a black box. The clerks, who for generations had been the masters of the ink, were now merely attendants to a process they no longer fully controlled. What doesn't add up is the lack of legal recourse taken by the victims. Thousands of citizens were effectively financially paralyzed, yet the court records of 1,899 show a surprising scarcity of lawsuits against the major agencies. This suggests one of two things. Either the victims were unaware of the source of their misfortune, or, as some researchers speculate, a series of quiet out-of-court settlements were reached to prevent a general panic that could have toppled the fragile post-1893 economy. There is a layer of evidence found in the private letters of bank managers from that autumn. They speak of the 1,899 gap, a period where they were instructed to rely on personal knowledge rather than official reports. It was a temporary return to the old ways, a desperate pivot back to a world of handshakes and local reputation because the centralized system had become a hall of mirrors. One personal story stands out in the few surviving fragments of this period. A woman named Clara Vance, a widow who managed a small printing press in New York, kept a diary detailing her 8-month struggle to prove her business had existed prior to 1,899. She wrote of visiting the agency offices daily, only to be told that her file had settled into the void. Her story was not unique, but her documentation of it was. She described the chilling sensation of being told by a clerk, with absolute certainty, that the documents she held in her own hands, her own receipts and contracts, were unofficial because they were not reflected in the master ledger. The experience of Clara Vance was a microcosm of a much larger, quieter catastrophe. As the summer of 1,899 bled into a humid autumn, the great discrepancy escalated from a clerical error into a systemic haunting. It wasn't just that names were disappearing, it was the way they were being replaced. In the records of the Bradstreet Company, researchers have noted a peculiar phenomenon: the emergence of placeholder identities. In the vacuum left by the erased histories of real merchants, the mechanical tabulators began to generate entries for individuals who never lived, with perfect credit scores and flawlessly balanced accounts. These were the ghost citizens of 1,000 899 digital specters created by a glitch in the very first era of data processing. The escalation was most visible in the shipping hubs of the Great Lakes and the rail yards of Chicago. Here, the speed of commerce demanded instant verification. When the systems failed, the gears of industry began to grind. A shipment of grain would arrive in Buffalo, but the buyer's credit statement had vanished overnight. The goods would sit, rotting in the hulls of ships, while lawyers frantically exchanged telegrams with New York, seeking a reality that the ledgers no longer recognized. It was a crisis of faith, as much as a crisis of finance. If the written record was the ultimate arbiter of truth, and the record was gone, what was left? But the silence from the press during this period wasn't an accident. It was a calculated, orchestrated blackout. Evidence suggests that the heads of the major mercantile agencies met in a series of private dinners at the Union League Club in New York during October of 1899. There are no official minutes of these meetings, but the diaries of bank executives who were present hint at a desperate pact. They realized that if the public understood the fragility of the new automated system, the entire banking structure could collapse in a wave of bank runs. The decision was made to absorb the error. The agencies would quietly settle with the most vocal victims, while the thousands of others, the small farmers, the widow printers, the immigrant shopkeepers, were simply allowed to drift into the shadows of the unbanked. What happened next remains unclear in the official histories, but the internal memos of the R.G. Dunn Company provide a chilling window into the turning point. By November, the error had reached a critical mass. The dead zone in the archives was now so large that it threatened to corrupt the data for the upcoming 1900 census. The machines were no longer just erasing the past. They were beginning to malfunction in their predictions of the future. The logic of the 19th century was failing to compute the arrival of the 20th. It was during this time that a new strategy emerged. If the records could not be recovered, they would be replaced by a new standard. This was the birth of the modern, homogenized credit profile, a system that prioritized current assets over historical character. It was a convenient solution to a disastrous problem. By shifting the goalposts of what constituted a reliable citizen, the agencies could effectively bypass the thousands of erased histories. They weren't fixing the error. They were rendering the lost lives irrelevant. But that wasn't the strangest part of the transition. As the deadline of December 31st approached, a rumor began to circulate among the clerks in the lower Manhattan offices. They spoke of the Great Purge of the 20th. According to some accounts, on the final week of 1899, massive quantities of ledger books, the original handwritten documents that served as the source of truth, were moved from the central archives to a series of warehouses in New Jersey. These were the documents that could have been used to reconstruct the erased statements. They were the physical evidence of 30 years of American life. And then, quite suddenly, the trail goes cold. There is no record of these warehouses ever being opened again. Some historians believe they were destroyed in a series of accidental fires that plagued the industrial waterfront in early 1900. Others suggest the documents were simply left to rot, a deliberate sacrifice to protect the integrity of the new, flawed mechanical system. The collapse of the old record-keeping world was nearly total. By the time the bells rang in the new century, the thousands of citizens whose credit had been erased were faced with a grim reality. They were standing in a new world that claimed to be more efficient and more transparent, but it was a world built on a foundation of missing pieces. To the new 20th century banks, these people were newly arrived, regardless of how many decades they had actually spent building their businesses. The personal cost was staggering. We see it in the bankruptcy filings of 1,900 and 1,901, a sudden, unexplained spike in failures among mid-sized firms that had previously been stable. These weren't victims of a market crash. They were victims of a data crash. Without their historical credit statements, they could no longer secure the bridge loans necessary to survive the seasonal fluctuations of the economy. They were erased not by a lack of money, but by a lack of proof. And that's when the narrative takes a modern, even more unsettling turn. For decades, the 1899 era was treated as a footnote in financial history, a quirky anecdote about the limitations of Victorian technology. It was seen as a relic of a primitive age. But in the early 2000s, as we began to digitize the remaining archives of the 19th century, researchers started to find something they didn't expect. They found that the era wasn't just a mechanical glitch in the adding machines. When modern algorithms were applied to the surviving fragments of the 1899 ledgers, a pattern emerged. The erasures weren't random. The data suggested that the glitch had disproportionately targeted specific demographics: immigrant communities in the Lower East Side, burgeoning black-owned businesses in the North, and women-led enterprises like that of Clara Vance. This has led some to a radical re-examination of the event. Was the 1899 era truly a technical failure, or was it a systemic cleansing? There is no clear consensus, but the statistical weight of the missing records is hard to ignore. Some believe that the machines didn't break. They were programmed to fail in a way that served the interests of the established elite. By erasing the credit of the unreliable new players in the economy, the traditional power structures could maintain their grip on the 20th century before it even began. It was the first instance of algorithmic bias, 100 years before we even had a name for it. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. As researchers dug deeper into the personal papers of the engineers who maintained the early tabulating machines, they found a series of panicked letters. These men weren't talking about a simple malfunction. They were talking about a logical loop that they couldn't break, a software error in a world before software. The engineers of 1899 were working with a technology that was, in many ways, ahead of their ability to govern it. The mechanical tabulator's complex arrangements of gears, pins, and punch cards operated on a binary logic that didn't allow for the nuance of human life. If a mechanical pin failed to drop, or if a card was slightly misaligned, the machine didn't stop. It simply recalculated reality. The logical loop discovered by researchers suggests that the error was self-reinforcing. Once a record was skipped, the machine's internal counter became desynchronized, causing it to skip every subsequent 10th or 20th entry in a cascading failure of data. By the time the new century was in full swing, the 1899 accounting error had been effectively buried under the noise of the industrial boom. The agencies moved forward with a new, more rigid system of credit ratings that prioritized standardized metrics over local testimonials. This shift, while seen as a move toward objective fairness, essentially finalized the erasure of the 1899 victims. There was no longer a place in the ledgers for a restored history. You were either in the new system, or you were a ghost. But the most chilling discovery wasn't in what was lost, but in what was kept. In the mid-1990s, a cache of documents was discovered in the basement of a former bank building in Manhattan. Among the water-damaged papers were the correction sheets from late 1899. These sheets contained thousands of names, the very names that had been erased from the official archives. Beside each name is a handwritten code. For decades, these codes were indecipherable. However, modern linguistic analysis suggests they were shorthand for unprofitable, unverified, or peripheral. Records suggest that the agencies didn't just lose the data. They may have used the mechanical error as a convenient cover to purge their files of accounts they deemed too risky or too expensive to maintain. In the eyes of the emerging financial giants, the 1899 era wasn't a tragedy. It was a cleanup. It allowed the 20th century credit system to begin with a curated population, effectively filtering out the marginalized and the small-scale competitors under the guise of a technical glitch. The aftermath of this event rippled through the decades, though it remained largely invisible. Families who lost their standing in 1899 often struggled for generations to regain the same level of capital. The credit gap created in a single year of clerical chaos became a permanent fixture of the American economic landscape. It set a precedent for how institutions handle data failure, by protecting the system and sacrificing the individual. Today, as we move into an era dominated by artificial intelligence and opaque algorithms, the 1899 era feels less like a historical curiosity and more like a warning. We are once again entrusting our identities, our reputations, and our futures to machines that operate in ways we don't fully understand. We rely on the permanence of digital records, much like the citizens of the Gilded Age relied on the permanence of the ledger. What happened next remains a subject of quiet debate among financial historians. Some argue that the 1899 era was the moment the human was removed from finance, replaced by a cold, mechanical judgment that persists to this day. Others believe it was simply the inevitable friction of a world changing too fast for its own systems to keep up. There is no clear consensus on whether the records of those thousands of citizens still exist in some forgotten corner of a New Jersey warehouse, or if they were truly fed into the furnaces of the past. What we do know is that for one brief moment at the turn of the century, the machinery of progress stumbled, and in that stumble, the lives of thousands simply vanished. In the end, the 1899 era serves as a haunting reminder of the fragility of the self in the face of the system. We are only as real as the records that say we are. And as we have seen, records can be changed. They can be lost. Or, if the situation demands it, they can be erased entirely, leaving nothing behind but the silence of a blank page and the steady, indifferent ticking of a machine that has already moved on to the next name.